Cowboy saved 2 native sisters from a flash flood. Next day, one whispered that she belonged to him. The blood on Caleb Winchester's hands wasn't his own. 3 days of tracking rustlers through the unforgiving Arizona territory had left him bone-weary and questioning every decision that brought him to this godforsaken stretch of desert. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered face as he guided his mare, Duchess, along the narrow canyon trail. What he expected to find was stolen cattle. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the rest of his days. The sound hit him first, a roar that didn't belong in the desert silence. Flash flood. His blood ran cold. In 20 years of frontier life, he'd seen these walls of water claim more lives than Apache raids and rattlesnake bites combined. The recent storms up north had been feeding the arroyos, and now nature was collecting her debt. Caleb spurred Duchess toward the sound, his instincts overriding common sense. That's when he saw them. 2 figures clung desperately to a twisted mesquite tree in the middle of what had been a dry creek bed 30 minutes ago. The muddy torrent surged around them with terrifying force, carrying debris that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. Native American women, he realized, their long black hair whipping in the wind as they fought to maintain their grip. The older one, maybe 25, had positioned herself between the younger girl and the worst of the current. Even from 50 yards away, Caleb could see the determination in her stance, the way she braced herself to take the impact of floating logs and rocks. The younger one, barely 20 by his estimation, had blood streaming down her temple, her grip visibly weakening. Time compressed. Caleb's rope was already in his hands before conscious thought caught up with instinct. The lariat sang through the air with practiced precision, the loop settling over the older woman's shoulders. She grabbed it without hesitation, understanding immediately. Her dark eyes met his across the churning water, and in that instant, something passed between them that transcended language, culture, and the prejudices that divided their worlds. "Hold tight," he shouted over the roar, though he doubted she could hear him. The rescue was brutal. Duchess strained against her reins, her hooves finding purchase on the rocky slope as Caleb worked to pull the women from the flood's grip. The mesquite tree groaned under the pressure, its roots finally giving way just as the older woman managed to wrap the rope around her sister's waist. They came out of the water like broken dolls, coughing up muddy water and gasping for air that seemed too thin. The younger one, unconscious now from blood loss and exhaustion, lay limp in her sister's protective embrace. The older woman's eyes never left Caleb's face as he worked, her gaze intense and searching, as if trying to memorize every detail of the man who had just pulled them back from death's door. "Easy now," Caleb murmured, his voice gentle despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd learned enough Apache and Navajo words during his years in the territory to attempt basic communication. "Safe, you're safe." The woman nodded slowly, then spoke in accented but clear English that surprised him. "My sister Ayana needs help." Her voice carried the musical cadence of her native tongue beneath the English words. Caleb found himself struck not just by her ability to communicate, but by the strength in her voice despite what she'd just endured. No tears, no hysteria, just focused concern for her injured sister. "What's your name?" he asked, already working to assess Ayana's injuries. "Kashina." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You have kind eyes for a white man." The comment should have stung, but something in her tone suggested it was more observation than accusation. Caleb had learned long ago that survival in the territory required seeing people as individuals rather than representatives of their race. The frontier had a way of stripping away pretense, leaving only the truth of a person's character. Ayana's head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp cuts always bled heavily. But her pulse was steady, her breathing regular. She'd have a headache for days, but she'd live. Caleb tore strips from his spare shirt to fashion a makeshift bandage, his movements efficient and practiced. Kashina watched every gesture, her dark eyes cataloging his actions with the precision of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "You've done this before," she observed. "Too many times." Caleb's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen more than his share of violence and suffering. "War teaches you things you never wanted to learn." As Ayanna began to regain consciousness, her eyes fluttered open to focus on Caleb's face hovering above her. For a moment, confusion clouded her features. Then recognition dawned, followed by something else, something that made Caleb shift uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "The cowboy with gentle hands," she whispered in English that was less polished than her sister's but clear enough to understand. Kashina translated something in their native tongue, and Ayanna nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact with Caleb. When she spoke again, it was directly to him. "You saved us." Anyone would have done the same. No. Ayanna's voice was soft but certain. Most would have ridden away. The truth of her statement hung in the air between them. Caleb had known plenty of men who would have done exactly that, ridden away rather than risk their lives for two Native American women they'd never met. The territory was hard on everyone, but it was especially brutal to those caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. As the immediate crisis passed, practical concerns took precedence. The women needed shelter, medical attention, and a way back to their people. Caleb's ranch was only 5 miles southwest, but taking two Native American women there would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. The nearest town, Copper Creek, was even less welcoming to Indians, regardless of circumstances. "Where's your camp?" he asked Kashina. Her expression shuddered slightly. 2 days north, but we cannot return yet." "Why not?" Kashina exchanged a look with her sister, some silent communication passing between them. When she turned back to Caleb, her expression was guarded. "There are complications." The word hung in the desert air like a storm cloud. Caleb had learned to read people during his years on the frontier, and everything about Kashina's body language screamed danger. Not danger to him, but danger waiting for them if they returned home too soon. What kind of complications? Before Kashina could answer, Ayanna struggled to sit up, her hand instinctively going to her injured head. When she spoke, it was with the directness of someone who'd faced death and lived to tell about it. "Our father wants to trade us to Crow Dog's band. Payment for horses he lost gambling." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He'd heard of such arrangements, though they were becoming less common as federal oversight of the reservations increased. Still, in the remote corners of the territory, old ways died hard. The idea of these two women being bartered like livestock made his jaw clench with barely contained anger. "Both of you?" Ayanna to the chief's son. "Me to his brother." Kashina's voice remained steady, but Caleb caught the slight tremor in her hands. "Crow Dog's people are not kind to women." The implication needed no elaboration. Caleb had heard the stories, seen the results of raids gone wrong on both sides of the cultural divide. Violence begat violence in an endless cycle that claimed the innocent along with the guilty. "So you ran." "We tried." Ayanna's voice was barely above a whisper. "The flood caught us in the arroyo. If you had not come—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Caleb found himself facing a dilemma that had no clean solution. He couldn't take them back to their father, that would be condemning them to a fate worse than death. He couldn't take them to town. The residents of Copper Creek had long memories and short tempers when it came to Indians. His ranch was isolated enough to provide temporary shelter, but word would eventually spread. In a territory where survival often depended on maintaining good relationships with all your neighbors, harboring runaway Indians was a dangerous proposition. Yet as he looked at these two women, Kashina, with her fierce protective instincts and intelligent eyes, Ayanna with her quiet strength and trusting gaze, he knew he couldn't simply abandon them to their fate. "My ranch is secure," he said finally. "You can stay there while we figure out a permanent solution." Kashina's eyes sharpened. "Why would you help us? We are nothing to you." It was a fair question, one Caleb wasn't sure he could answer honestly. Part of it was simple human decency. He'd been raised by parents who believed in helping those in need, regardless of their race or circumstances. Part of it was his own complicated relationship with authority and social expectations. He'd never been good at following rules he didn't agree with, but there was something else, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge even to himself. Something about the way Kashina looked at him, as if she could see past the weathered exterior to the man he'd once hoped to be. Something about Ayana's trusting smile that reminded him why he'd originally come west, not to find gold or claim land, but to find a place where a man's worth was measured by his actions rather than his bloodline. "Maybe you're not nothing," he said quietly. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than any of them were prepared to examine. Kashina studied his face with that same intense scrutiny, looking for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "We will come with you." As they prepared for the journey to his ranch, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped across a line he couldn't uncross. The territory was full of men who'd made similar decisions and lived to regret them. But as Ayana smiled at him, a smile that lit up her entire face despite the bandage wrapped around her head, he found himself unable to care about the consequences. Some lines were worth crossing. The ride to the Winchester Ranch took 3 hours through terrain that grew progressively more hospitable as they moved away from the flood-scarred arroyos. Caleb had built his spread in a valley protected by natural rock formations, with a year-round spring that had never failed him in 8 years of residence. The main house was modest but well-constructed, built to withstand both the harsh desert climate and the occasional Apache raid that had plagued the area in earlier years. Kashina rode behind him on Duchess, her arms wrapped around his waist in a way that made him hyper-aware of every breath she took. Ayana managed her own mount, a gentle gelding Caleb kept for guests, despite her injury, proving herself to be an accomplished horsewoman. As they crested the final ridge before the ranch came into view, both women fell silent. The Winchester spread wasn't large by Texas standards, but it represented 8 years of backbreaking labor and careful planning. The main house sat in the center of the valley, surrounded by outbuildings that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. A well-tended garden provided vegetables, while a small orchard of fruit trees offered shade and sustenance. Cattle grazed in nearby pastures, their brands clearly marking them as Winchester stock. "You built all this yourself?" Kashina asked, and Caleb caught the note of respect in her voice. "Most of it. Had help with the barn raising and some of the heavier construction." What he didn't mention was how many of his neighbors had initially tried to drive him out, viewing him as just another drifter looking for easy money. 8 years of honest dealing and hard work had earned their grudging respect, but he knew how quickly that respect could evaporate if they discovered he was harboring Indian runaways. As they dismounted in front of the main house, Caleb caught Ayana studying him with that same intense gaze he'd noticed earlier. There was something different about the way she looked at him now, something that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't define. "This is a good place," she said softly. "A place where a person could be happy." The wistful note in her voice struck him unexpectedly. How long had it been since either of these women had felt truly safe? The question bothered him more than he cared to admit. Inside, the house was spartanly furnished but clean and comfortable. Caleb had never seen the need for fancy decorations or unnecessary luxuries, but everything was well made and functional. The main room combined kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace that provided both heat and cooking facilities. 2 bedrooms and a small study completed the layout. "You can take the main bedroom," he told the women. "I'll sleep in the study." Kashina shook her head. "We will not put you out of your own bed. It's not a request." Something in his tone brooked no argument. Kashina studied his face for a moment, then nodded acceptance. As evening approached, the 3 of them fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Kashina proved to be an excellent cook, transforming Caleb's simple supplies into a meal that was both nourishing and flavorful. Ayanna, despite her injury, insisted on helping with preparation and cleanup. It was during the meal that Ayanna made the comment that would change everything. They were discussing practical matters, how long the women could safely remain at the ranch, what options existed for permanent relocation, when Ayanna suddenly fell silent. Caleb looked up to find her staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "What is it?" Instead of answering directly, she spoke to her sister in their native tongue. Kashina's response was sharp and clearly disapproving, but Ayanna continued speaking with quiet intensity. Finally, Kashina threw up her hands in frustration and turned to Caleb. "My sister has ideas that are not practical." "What kind of ideas?" Ayanna leaned forward, her dark eyes serious. "Among our people, when someone saves your life, they become responsible for it. The debt can only be repaid through service or ... double quotes." She paused, searching for the right English words. "Through belonging." The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Caleb felt his throat tighten as he began to understand where this was heading. "Ayanna," Kashina said sharply, but her sister ignored the warning. "You saved our lives. According to our customs, we belong to you now. Both of us." The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb stared at Ayanna, then at Kashina, seeing the resignation in the older sister's eyes. This wasn't some impulsive declaration. This was a serious cultural obligation as far as Ayanna was concerned. "That's not how this works," Caleb said finally. "I helped because it was the right thing to do. No payment required, no obligations created." Ayanna shook her head. "You do not understand. The debt exists whether you acknowledge it or not. We cannot return to our father. We cannot survive alone in the territory. We have nothing to offer except ourselves." The conversation was veering into territory that made Caleb deeply uncomfortable. He'd lived alone for 8 years by choice, maintaining careful distance from emotional entanglements that could complicate his carefully ordered life. The idea of 2 women suddenly declaring themselves his responsibility was both alarming and, if he was honest with himself, unexpectedly appealing. There have to be other options. "Name one," Kashina challenged, speaking for the first time since her sister's declaration. "Where can 2 Indian women go in this territory where they will be safe? Who will protect us? Provide for us?" The questions hung unanswered because they all knew the truth. Options for Native American women in the Arizona Territory were limited and dangerous. Reservations offered little protection and less opportunity. Towns were openly hostile. The wilderness was unforgiving to anyone traveling alone. As the evening wore on and practical concerns gave way to emotional undercurrents, Caleb found himself watching both women with new eyes. Kashina, with her fierce intelligence and protective instincts, would be a formidable partner for any man brave enough to earn her respect. Ayanna, despite her youth, possessed a quiet strength and gentle wisdom that spoke of deep inner resources. The thought of them belonging to him, of taking responsibility for their safety and well-being, was simultaneously terrifying and intoxicating. He'd spent 8 years convincing himself that solitude was preferable to the complications of human relationships. Now, faced with the possibility of instant family, he wasn't sure what he wanted. That night, as he lay on the narrow cot in his study, Caleb could hear the soft murmur of the sisters' voices through the thin walls. They were speaking in their native tongue, but he caught his own name repeated several times. He wondered what they were saying, what they were planning. More importantly, he wondered what he was going to do about Ayanna's declaration, because despite his protests to the contrary, part of him was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to give them up. The next morning brought both clarity and confusion in equal measure. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread, luxuries he rarely indulged in when cooking for himself. Through the thin walls separating his study from the kitchen, he could hear the sisters moving about with quiet efficiency. their voices a gentle backdrop to the domestic sounds of breakfast preparation. When he emerged, fully dressed and trying to project an air of normal routine despite the extraordinary circumstances, he found both women already at work. Kashina stood at the stove, tending to eggs that sizzled in his best cast iron skillet, while Ayana set the table with careful precision. The bandage around her head was clean and properly positioned evidence that Kashina possessed more medical knowledge than he'd initially realized. What struck him most forcefully wasn't their efficiency or domestic skills, but how naturally they'd fitted themselves into his space. Nothing had been moved or rearranged, yet somehow the house felt more alive than it had in years. Sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter, the familiar rooms warmer and more welcoming. "Good morning," Ayana said, turning to face him with a smile that made something twist unexpectedly in his chest. Despite the trauma of the previous day, she looked rested and alert. More than that, she looked happy in a way that seemed almost radiant. "How's your head?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "Better. Your sister has healing hands." She gestured toward Kashina, then caught herself. Kashina has healing hands." The slip was telling. In her mind, they were already family. The realization should have alarmed him, but instead, it stirred something warm and protective in his chest. "Ayana," Kashina said softly, a warning note in her voice. But her younger sister ignored the caution, stepping closer to Caleb with that same direct gaze that had unsettled him the night before. "I meant what I said last night. About belonging to you." "Ayana, we discussed this. We discussed your fears." Ayana interrupted, never taking her eyes off Caleb's face. "Not my feelings." The word hung between them like a challenge. Feelings. Not just cultural obligation or gratitude, but genuine emotion. Caleb found himself studying her face, looking for signs of confusion or misplaced hero worship. What he saw instead was the steady regard of a woman who knew her own mind. "You don't know me," he said finally. "Yesterday was the first time we met. I know you risked your life to save two women you'd never met. I know you brought us to your home instead of abandoning us in the desert. I know you gave us your bed and slept on that uncomfortable cot because you wanted us to feel safe." Each point she made was delivered with quiet conviction, her accent in English growing more confident with each word. Caleb found himself unable to argue with her logic, even as every instinct screamed that the situation was moving too fast. "I know your hands are gentle when you tend wounds," she continued. "I know you have books in your study because I saw them last night. Not many men in the territory can read, but you choose to surround yourself with learning. I know you built all of this with your own labor because there's pride in everything you've created." Her observations were unnervingly accurate. Few people bothered to look beyond the surface when evaluating others, but Ayana seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to read character and motivation. "Most importantly," she said, stepping close enough that he could smell the subtle fragrance of sage and wildflowers that seemed to cling to her skin, "I know you're not like the other white men we've encountered. There's no cruelty in you, no need to dominate or control. You saved us because it was right, not because you wanted something in return. That doesn't mean, it means everything." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but her words carried absolute conviction. "Among my people, character reveals itself in crisis. How a person acts when they have nothing to gain and everything to lose, that's who they truly are." Caleb felt the weight of her gaze, the intensity of her belief in him. It was both humbling and terrifying to be seen so clearly by someone he barely knew. Part of him wanted to protest that she was mistaken, that he wasn't the man she thought he was. But the larger part, the part that had been lonely for longer than he cared to admit, found himself hoping she was right. Kashina had remained silent during this exchange, but now she cleared her throat pointedly. "Breakfast is ready," she announced, her tone carefully neutral. They ate in relative quiet, the undercurrents of the earlier conversation still flowing beneath the surface. Caleb found his attention split between practical concerns, what to do about supplies, whether anyone had noticed his absence from town, how long he could realistically shelter the women without drawing unwanted attention, and the increasingly urgent awareness of Ayana's presence beside him. She ate with careful precision, her table manners reflecting an upbringing that had included contact with white society. Yet there was something inherently graceful about her movements, a natural elegance that spoke of cultural traditions far older than frontier etiquette. "We need to talk about practical matters," he said finally, forcing himself to focus on immediate concerns rather than the way the morning light brought out gold highlights in Ayana's dark hair. "Such as?" Kashina asked. "Supplies, for one thing. I wasn't provisioned for 3 people. Someone's going to notice if I suddenly start buying extra food and clothing in town." "We can hunt," Ayana offered. "Both of us know how to trap small game and gather wild plants. We won't be a burden." "It's not about being a burden. It's about staying invisible until we figure out a permanent solution." "Perhaps," Kashina said carefully, "the solution is simpler than you think." Caleb looked at her sharply. "Meaning?" "Meaning that if you truly accepted our presence here, there would be no need to hide anything. A man has the right to take wives, even Indian wives, if he chooses." The word wives hit him like a physical blow, plural, both of them. The implications were staggering, not just legally and socially, but personally. The idea of being responsible for 2 women, of having them both look to him for protection and guidance, was overwhelming. "That's not, the law doesn't exactly ... The law recognizes common law marriages," Kashina said matter-of-factly, "especially in territories where clergy and courts are scarce. If you claimed us as your wives, most people would accept it as legitimate, even if they didn't approve. And if they didn't accept it, then we face whatever comes together," Ayana said simply. "But at least we face it as family." There was that word again, family. Caleb had been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to belong to something larger than himself. The war had stripped away his connections to home and heritage, leaving him adrift in a hostile world with nothing but his own determination to sustain him. The idea of suddenly having not just companionship but genuine partnership, 2 intelligent, capable women who saw something in him worth protecting and cherishing, was both tempting and terrifying. "This is moving too fast," he said, but even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "Life in the territory moves fast," Kashina replied. "People make decisions quickly because hesitation can be fatal. You saved our lives yesterday. Today, we're offering you something in return. Tomorrow." She shrugged eloquently. "Tomorrow brings whatever it brings." After breakfast, the 3 of them fell into a routine that felt both natural and charged with unspoken possibilities. Caleb attended to his usual ranch duties, checking the cattle, repairing a section of fence damaged by the recent storms, maintaining equipment that couldn't afford to break down in the harsh desert environment. But his attention kept drifting to the women as they explored his property with obvious curiosity and growing appreciation. They moved through his domain with the easy confidence of people accustomed to reading landscape and weather, noting details he'd long since taken for granted. He watched Ayana kneel beside his vegetable garden, her fingers trailing through the soil as she evaluated its quality and potential. Her expression was thoughtful, and he found himself wondering what improvements she might suggest, what changes she would make if this truly became her home. Kashina, meanwhile, had discovered his small library and was examining his collection of books with obvious delight. Most were practical volumes, agricultural manuals, veterinary guides, basic medical texts, but a few reflected more personal interests. Poetry, history, even a battered copy of Shakespeare that had somehow survived his journey west. "You read for pleasure," she observed when he joined her in the study. "Sometimes? Long winters get lonely. What's your favorite?" He gestured toward a slim volume of Whitman's poetry. "That one gets me through the hardest nights." She pulled the book from the shelf and opened it to a random page, her eyes scanning the verses with obvious understanding. When she looked up, there was something new in her expression, a recognition that went beyond cultural or racial boundaries. "Song of myself," she read aloud. "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. But the connection was undeniable. Two people discovering unexpected common ground in the middle of a vast and often hostile wilderness. Outside, Ayana's laughter drifted through the windows as she played with a half-grown barn cat that had appeared from nowhere to investigate the newcomers. The sound was like music, bright and joyous in a way that transformed the familiar surroundings into something magical. "She's not usually so carefree," Kashina said softly, following his gaze toward the window. "The last few months have been difficult for her. Our father ... She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Our father is not a happy man. His disappointments have made him cruel." "What kind of disappointments?" "The usual kind. Lost chances, broken promises, dreams that turn to dust in his hands. He drinks too much and gambles more than he can afford to lose. When the losses pile up, he looks for ways to balance the scales, using his daughters as currency. Among other things." Kashina's voice carried years of accumulated pain. "Ayana has been protected from the worst of it, but she's not naive. She knows what awaits her if she returns home. And you?" Kashina's smile was bitter. "I stopped being innocent a long time ago, but I've learned to fight and I've learned to run. Yesterday was just the latest escape attempt." The conversation was interrupted by Ayana's appearance in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from sun and exercise, her eyes bright with happiness. "Caleb, come see what I found," she said, reaching for his hand with unconscious familiarity. Her touch sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through him. Her skin was soft despite the rough life she'd led, her fingers small but strong. When she tugged him toward the door, he found himself following without protest. She led him to a sheltered spot behind the main house where a natural spring fed a small pool before continuing its journey toward the larger creek that watered his cattle. The area was shaded by cottonwoods and blessed with the kind of lush vegetation that desert dwellers treasured above gold. "This is perfect for a garden," she said, her enthusiasm infectious. "The soil is rich, the water is reliable, and the trees provide protection from the worst of the summer heat. We could grow vegetables, herbs, maybe even flowers." The word "we" slipped out so naturally that neither of them commented on it directly, but Caleb felt its impact like a physical force. She wasn't just admiring his property, she was envisioning their shared future within it. "It would take a lot of work," he said carefully. "I'm not afraid of work." Her gaze met his directly, challenging and confident. "Are you afraid of having help?" The question cut deeper than he'd expected. Was he afraid? After 8 years of solitary labor, the idea of sharing both the work and the rewards was undeniably appealing. But it was also terrifying in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "It's not about fear," he said finally. "It's about making sure everyone understands what they're getting into." "What am I getting into?" she asked, stepping closer until he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Hard work, isolation, neighbors who might not accept you, a man who's gotten set in his ways and might not be easy to live with." "What are you getting into?" she countered. The question stopped him cold. What was he getting into? Two women whose presence would complicate every aspect of his carefully ordered existence. Cultural tensions that could explode into violence without warning. Legal ambiguities that could destroy everything he'd built. Emotional entanglements that could shatter his heart if things went wrong. But also companionship, purpose beyond mere survival. The possibility of building something larger and more meaningful than anything he could create alone. "I don't know," he admitted. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said simply. That evening, as the desert air began to cool and the sky painted itself in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the surrounding mountains in fire. It was a scene of such domestic tranquility that Caleb could almost forget the complexities that lay beneath the surface, almost, because tomorrow would bring decisions that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between the safety of his solitary existence and the uncertain promise of something he'd never dared to hope for. Tomorrow, Ayanna would expect an answer to her declaration of belonging. And tonight, as he lay in his narrow cot listening to the sisters' soft voices through the walls, Caleb Winchester would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The answer came at dawn, delivered not through words but through action that would define the rest of their lives. Caleb woke to the sound of horses approaching his ranch, multiple riders moving with the deliberate pace of men on serious business. Through the window of his study, he could see dust clouds rising in the distance, still too far to identify individual riders but close enough to trigger every survival instinct he'd developed during 8 years of frontier living. He dressed quickly, checking his rifle and sidearm with practiced efficiency. Whatever was coming, he intended to meet it prepared. The sisters were already awake, their expressions tense as they peered through the kitchen window toward the approaching riders. Kashina's hand rested on a knife she'd somehow acquired, probably from his kitchen, while Ayanna stood close enough to her sister to move quickly if necessary. "How many?" Kashina asked without turning around. 6, maybe 7. Caleb moved to join them at the window, his jaw tightening as the riders came into clearer view. "And they're not here for a social visit." The lead rider was a man Caleb recognized, Thomas Crow Dog, a Chiricahua Apache whose reputation for violence was matched only by his skill at avoiding territorial law enforcement. Behind him rode a mixture of Apache warriors and white men, an unusual alliance that spoke to serious business. "My father," Ayanna whispered, her face going pale as she identified one of the riders. "And mine," Kashina added grimly. "Along with the men we were promised to." The situation crystallized with brutal clarity. This wasn't a random visit or a coincidence. Somehow, their father had tracked them here, probably through skills honed by generations of desert survival. Now he'd come to collect what he considered his property, backed by the very men who'd purchased rights to his daughters. "Get to the back bedroom," Caleb ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to life or death decisions. "Stay away from the windows and don't come out unless I call for you." "No." Ayanna's voice was soft but absolute. "We face this together. This isn't a discussion. You're right." She stepped closer to him, her dark eyes blazing with determination. "It's not a discussion because there's nothing to discuss. We belong here now. We belong to you. That means we fight beside you, not hide behind you." Before Caleb could protest further, the riders were close enough for individual recognition. Thomas Crow Dog raised his hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture, but the weapons visible on every man suggested otherwise. They came to a halt 20 yards from the house, positioned to cover all escape routes. Caleb stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but ready for immediate use. Behind him, he could sense rather than see the sisters taking positions where they could support him if violence erupted. "Crow Dog," he called out, his voice carrying across the morning air, "you're a long way from your usual hunting grounds." "We hunt what belongs to us," the Apache leader replied in accented but clear English, "no matter how far it runs. Nothing here belongs to you. 2 women, daughters of Joseph Redhawk." Crow Dog gestured toward one of the other riders, an older Native American man whose resemblance to the sisters was unmistakable. "They were promised to my sons in payment for horses. The debt must be honored." Caleb's gaze shifted to Joseph Redhawk, seeing the family resemblance but also the weakness that had driven him to gamble away his daughter's freedom. The man couldn't meet his eyes, staring instead at the ground with the shame of someone who knew exactly how far he'd fallen. "Debts can be paid in other ways," Caleb said carefully. "The terms were agreed upon. The women were given freely by their father. They belong to my family now." "Seems to me they disagree with that assessment," Crow Dog's expression darkened. What women think is not important. The agreement stands. It was then that Ayanna stepped onto the porch beside Caleb, her chin raised in defiance despite the obvious danger. The sight of her seemed to galvanize the riders, several of them shifting in their saddles with barely contained aggression. "I am no longer my father's daughter," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "I have given myself to this man according to the old laws. He saved my life, and now my life belongs to him." "You have no right." Joseph Red Hawk started to speak, but Crow Dog silenced him with a sharp gesture. "The old laws," Crow Dog repeated thoughtfully. "You claim the right of life debt? I claim nothing. I state fact." Ayanna moved closer to Caleb, her shoulder brushing his arm in a gesture that clearly established their connection. "He saved me from the floodwaters. He saved my sister. Our lives are his by right of rescue." The Apache leader's eyes narrowed as he considered this claim. Among his people, as among many Native American tribes, the concept of life debt was sacred and legally binding. A person whose life was saved belonged to their rescuer until the debt was properly discharged. "The white man acknowledges this debt?" Crow Dog asked. Every eye turned to Caleb. This was the moment of decision he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Everything, the safety of the women, his own future, the lives of everyone present hinged on his next words. "I do," he said quietly. The admission sent ripples through both groups. Joseph Red Hawk looked stricken, finally understanding that he'd lost his daughters permanently. Crow Dog's sons, two young men who'd been counting on claiming their promised brides, exchanged dark looks that promised future trouble. "The debt supersedes previous agreements," Crow Dog admitted reluctantly. "But compensation must be paid for the broken promises." "What kind of compensation?" "Horses. 20 head of good stock to replace what was promised." 20 horses represented a significant portion of Caleb's herd, but it was manageable. More importantly, it offered a way out of the confrontation that didn't involve bloodshed. 15, he countered, and 3 head of cattle to sweeten the deal. Crow Dog considered this for a long moment, his gaze shifting between Caleb and the sisters. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Acceptable. But understand this, Winchester. You have claimed a responsibility for these women. Their actions reflect on you now. Their debts become your debts. Their enemies become your enemies." The warning was clear. By accepting the sisters into his protection, Caleb was also accepting all the complications that came with them. Future troubles with their father, potential conflicts with other tribal members, the constant vigilance required to protect 2 women in a hostile territory. "Understood," Caleb replied. As the riders prepared to leave with their negotiated compensation, Joseph Red Hawk finally found the courage to speak directly to his daughters. "This is not what I wanted for you," he said, his voice heavy with shame and regret. "No," Kashina replied coldly. "What you wanted was to erase your gambling debts with our bodies. At least this man offers us dignity." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Joseph Red Hawk flinched as if physically struck, but he didn't attempt to defend his actions. Perhaps because he knew there was no defense for what he'd tried to do. As the group rode away, leading 15 horses and 3 cattle, silence settled over the ranch like dust after a whirlwind. The immediate crisis had passed, but the implications of what had just occurred were staggering. "So," Kashina said finally, "it's done." "It's done," Caleb agreed. But Ayanna stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face with that same intense scrutiny he'd come to expect from her. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. The question deserved an honest answer. Did he regret claiming responsibility for 2 women he barely knew? Did he regret taking on obligations that would complicate every aspect of his carefully ordered life? "Ask me in a year," he said. Her smile in response was like sunrise after the darkest night, bright, warm, and full of promise. The days that followed established new rhythms and routines that gradually transformed the Winchester Ranch from a solitary man's domain into something resembling a true home. The sisters threw themselves into their new roles with enthusiasm and intelligence that impressed Caleb daily. Ayanna's vision for the garden behind the house became reality through back-breaking labor that she attacked with relentless determination. Working from dawn until dusk, she cleared brush, amended soil, and planted crops that would provide both sustenance and beauty. Her knowledge of desert plants was encyclopedic. She knew which cacti produced edible fruit, which roots could be ground into flour during lean times, which herbs had medicinal properties. But it was her approach to the work that most impressed Caleb. She didn't simply plant a garden. She created an ecosystem. Vegetables grew alongside native plants that attracted beneficial insects. Water channels directed precious moisture with maximum efficiency. Every element served multiple purposes, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of desert agriculture that few white settlers possessed. Kashina, meanwhile, revolutionized the household's domestic operations with quiet efficiency. She possessed skills that Caleb had never expected, not just cooking and cleaning, but leatherworking, textile repair, and basic veterinary medicine. Under her care, his equipment lasted longer, his clothes stayed in better repair, and his meals became genuine pleasures rather than mere fuel for survival. More than their practical contributions, however, was the simple fact of their presence. The ranch house, which had felt appropriately sized for a single man, now hummed with conversation, laughter, and the thousand small sounds of family life. Evenings that had once stretched endlessly now passed quickly in discussion, storytelling, and the comfortable silence of people who enjoyed each other's company. It was during one such evening, approximately 2 weeks after the confrontation with Crow Dog, that the subject of marriage finally arose directly. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Kashina made a casual observation that stopped conversation cold. "The preacher will be in Copper Creek next month for the Henderson wedding," she said. "If we wanted to make things legal, that would be the time to do it." Legal. The word hung in the desert air like a challenge. They'd been living as a family for weeks now, but without formal ceremonies or documentation. In the eyes of the law, they were simply a man providing shelter to 2 Native American women, a situation that was legally ambiguous and socially questionable. "Is that what you want?" Caleb asked. "Legal recognition? It's not about what I want," Kashina replied. "It's about protection. If something happened to you, what would become of us? Without legal standing, we'd have no claim to anything we've helped build here." The practical implications were sobering. Frontier life was dangerous, and sudden death was always a possibility. If Caleb were killed or injured, the sisters would be left completely vulnerable without legal protection. "There's another consideration," Ayanna added quietly. "Children." The word sent a jolt of awareness through Caleb. Children. He'd barely adjusted to the idea of having 2 women in his life. The possibility of fatherhood seemed overwhelming. "Are you?" He began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the question. "Not yet," Ayanna said with a directness that made his face heat. "But we're living as husband and wives in everything but name. Nature will take its course eventually." The casual acknowledgement of their intimate relationships that had developed naturally over the past weeks, stirred something possessive and protective in Caleb's chest. These women weren't just his responsibility anymore. They were his partners in every sense of the word. "The preacher might have opinions about plural marriage," he said carefully. "Reverend Martinez has been in the territory for 15 years, Kashina replied. "He's seen every possible arrangement people make to survive out here. As long as everyone's willing, he'll perform the ceremony. And you're both willing?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. This was the moment when theory became reality, when cultural obligation transformed into genuine choice. "I've been willing since the day you pulled us from the flood," Ayanna said simply. "The question is whether you're willing." Caleb looked at these two remarkable women who transformed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined a month ago. Kashina, with her fierce intelligence and protective instincts, who challenged him intellectually while supporting him practically. Ayana, with her gentle strength and unwavering faith in his character, who made him want to be worthy of her trust. "I'm willing," he said. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in the small church that served Copper Creek and the surrounding ranches. Reverend Martinez had agreed to perform the ceremony with minimal questions and maximum discretion, understanding that frontier survival sometimes required arrangements that Eastern society might not approve of. The guest list was deliberately small, just a handful of neighbors who'd accepted the unconventional family structure and wanted to show their support. Tom Bradley, who owned the adjacent ranch, served as best man. Sarah Jennings, one of the few women in the area who'd befriended the sisters despite cultural prejudices, acted as matron of honor. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Traditional vows were exchanged, adapted slightly to acknowledge the unique nature of their arrangement. When Reverend Martinez pronounced them husband and wives, the words carried weight that went far beyond legal formality. They were family now, bound by law as well as love. The wedding feast, held at the ranch house, was a revelation in its own right. Neighbors who'd initially been suspicious of the arrangement found themselves charmed by the sisters' grace and intelligence. Ayana's cooking drew compliments from women who'd been preparing frontier meals for decades. Kashina's knowledge of local history and geography impressed men who thought they knew everything about their territory. By the time the last guest departed, Caleb realized that his wives had accomplished something he'd never thought possible. They'd created genuine acceptance for their unconventional family within the broader community. That night, alone with his wives for the first time as legally married partners, Caleb felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. Everything he'd built over 8 years of solitary labor had suddenly acquired deeper meaning because it was now shared with people who understood and appreciated his vision. No regrets? Ayana asked, echoing her question from weeks earlier. None, he replied, and meant it completely. Winter brought new challenges and deeper bonds. The desert could be harsh during the cold months, with sudden storms that tested both preparation and resourcefulness. But the Winchester family faced each crisis together, their combined skills and knowledge proving more than adequate to handle whatever nature delivered. It was during a particularly severe blizzard in January that Ayana made an announcement that would change everything once again. "I'm with child," she said simply during breakfast, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. A child. His child. The abstract possibility had become concrete reality, bringing with it joy, terror, and a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "How long?" Kashina asked, moving immediately into practical mode. 2 months, maybe 3. The baby should come in late summer. The timeline made sense. The wedding had been in October, but they'd been living as a family for weeks before that. Their first child would be born into a world that might not fully accept them, but would never doubt they were wanted and loved. "Are you happy?" Caleb asked, suddenly uncertain despite the obvious joy in Ayana's expression. "Happier than I've ever been," she replied. "This child will grow up free, protected, and loved. What more could any mother want?" Spring brought preparations for both the new baby and the expansion of their family operations. The garden Ayana had planted the previous year had exceeded all expectations, producing surplus crops that could be sold in town for badly needed cash. Kashina's skills with leather and textiles had created a small but profitable side business, making goods for neighboring ranches. Most importantly, they'd proven that their unconventional arrangement could not only survive but thrive. The prejudices they'd faced initially had largely given way to respect and acceptance as their neighbors recognized the strength and stability of their partnership. As Ayanna's pregnancy progressed, Caleb found himself marveling at the changes in his life. A year ago, he'd been a solitary man focused solely on survival and self-sufficiency. Now he was a husband, soon-to-be father, and part of a family that had brought meaning and purpose to everything he'd built. The baby arrived on a sweltering August day, delivered by Kashina with assistance from Sarah Jennings and Doc Peterson from town. The labor was difficult but not dangerous, lasting from dawn until late afternoon before producing a healthy son with his father's strong features and his mother's dark eyes. As Caleb held his son for the first time, feeling the baby's tiny fingers grip his thumb with surprising strength, he understood with perfect clarity why he'd risk everything to save two women from a flash flood a year earlier. Some decisions transcended logic or careful planning. Some risks were worth taking regardless of the consequences. Some promises, once made, changed everything forever. "What will we name him?" Ayanna asked, exhausted but radiant with joy. Caleb looked at his wife, then at Kashina, who stood beside the bed with tears of happiness streaming down her face, then back at the son who represented their shared future. "Gabriel," he said finally, "for new beginnings." Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain, the first moisture they'd received in months. It seemed fitting somehow, this promise of growth and renewal arriving with their firstborn son. The Winchester family had begun a new chapter in their unlikely story, one that would be written by three people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pasts. In the end, that was perhaps the most remarkable thing about their story, not that a cowboy had saved two Native American sisters from a flash flood, but that they'd all saved each other from lives of loneliness and limitation. Some rescues, Caleb reflected as he watched his son sleep in his mother's arms, went both ways, and some whispered promises, made in desperation and sealed with hope, proved strong enough to transform three separate souls into one unbreakable family. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of tomorrow. In the Winchester ranch house, three people who'd found each other against impossible odds settled into the quiet contentment of a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for the testing. Their story had begun with blood on a stranger's hands and a flood that nearly claimed two lives. It would continue with the laughter of children, the steady accumulation of shared memories, and the absolute certainty that some bonds, once forged in crisis and tempered by choice, could never be broken. The cowboy had indeed saved two Native American sisters from a flash flood, but in saving them, he'd also saved himself from a life half-lived and dreams unfulfilled. And when one of them whispered that she belonged to him, she'd spoken a truth that would echo through generations yet unborn, a promise that love, once freely given and gratefully received, creates obligations that transform duty into joy and survival into something approaching grace. In the end, they all belonged to each other, bound by ties stronger than blood, deeper than culture, and more enduring than the harsh desert that had brought them together. The Winchester family had written their own definition of love, loyalty, and home, one that would stand as testament to the power of choice over circumstance, hope over fear, and the human heart's infinite capacity for growth and renewal. Their story would be told around campfires and dinner tables for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings, and that love, when it arrives, often comes disguised as crisis and opportunity in equal measure.